So I take the opportunity again to take a moment before our substantive presentation and reflect on things that are happening around us. And while these slides might look familiar to those of you who were with us in August, I want to just mention a couple of things that have changed and are different and are things for you all to keep in mind. First, as I mentioned, I'm the executive director of STAC. We're an anti-trafficking organization here based in Leon County in the Panhandle, but we serve the 6 counties around us, including Leon, in this North Florida region. We, though, all the time are getting calls and referrals from people from all around the state. So that's one reason why we're thrilled to have you. And our twin mission is to do this kind of work, to do the awareness and education, and to provide direct case management services to people who have been trafficked and people who are at risk of being trafficked. So in our situation here, we're able to do that with many, many partners, which I know you're going to hear about partnerships today. But as you know, human trafficking victims can be from all walks, from all ages, from all immigration status, everything. And everybody's got different needs. And so we work hard to partner with people so that we can provide the case management and expertise around human trafficking and then connect them to the housing, counseling, other kinds of services as needed. So today, to kick us off, I wanted to just have some reflections on human trafficking, and wanted to start out by just, again, looking at what's happening around us. We know, of course, COVID is out there, but we just went through Hurricane Sally here in Florida. Pensacola got slammed, and we're in the middle of hurricane season, and it's really important for us to keep in mind that human trafficking absolutely continues and sometimes even grows further when you have crises. In terms of crises, that can be a hurricane, any kind of natural disaster, right? It can be an economic crisis. We have millions unemployed now. We can look at COVID. We have isolation. We have disparate impacts on certain populations, on communities of color, on any vulnerable populations that were vulnerable before all this started, right? And it's important for you to realize that traffickers indeed thrive during these times. They're very nimble. They could be big organized crime organizations, or they could be one single person. And they will indeed exploit people for commercial benefit and gain in sex and labor. In fact, one of the things that I've seen this was in an article with the New York Task Force, I think, talking about how online traffickers are advertising victims by saying they're going to, just tell us, they'll wear a mask and a glove if you want, gloves if you want. So we know that this is continuing, and that the people who are vulnerable before are even more vulnerable. We see a lot of inequities in our society, and we know, for example, that people of color, African Americans, are dying at a rate 3.5 to 10 times more than white people of COVID. And that really is rooted in a lot of systemic discrimination and inequities in our world and injustices. So traffickers are going to take full advantage of that reality. Specifically with COVID, it's really important for everyone to keep in mind what's going on, particularly now. We have a lot of kids, youth that are doing their schoolwork remotely. And that is, of course, a place where traffickers do their recruitment of youth. We know that traffickers have been isolating their victims, lying. We often see gaslighting and misinformation going from traffickers to victims. And remember, those victims can be family members. So you can see this in domestic violence situations. And you also need to keep in mind, too, that sometimes we artificially bifurcate sex and labor trafficking. But we know, for example, that labor trafficking victims are sexually exploited, as well as sex trafficking victims that are forced to work, to clean hotel rooms, or to do other kinds of labor. So keep in mind that this is a very wide-ranging topic, and that particularly during COVID, we've seen options be limited. And I know that our speakers are going to talk a little bit about this, but I know we've seen up here limited options in terms of congregate living facilities like shelters have had to change their mode of operation. We've seen limited accessibility to some traditional places we've been able to place survivors. So know that all this is happening. And it's also happening in a world where law enforcement and every other kind of profession is taxed and is stressed in different ways. So that's the essence of my introduction and kind of a thoughts for the day thing. Welcome your opportunity. Oh, and there's one other thing I wanted to mention on this. Um, we've been seeing, and I haven't mentioned this to Cardad and Teresa yet, but I've been seeing things in the press which I would call conspiracy theories about child trafficking. We've seen the Wayfair Gate, if you will. We've seen some of these conspiracy theorists talking about child trafficking, prompting calls to the hotline and other service providers that are actually taking their time and energy away from dealing with real cases of human trafficking. So we want you to be on the lookout, particularly, and if we have any of our law enforcement friends, or you all can address this as well, to talk about how we have to really stick to the facts on these things. And when we have these kinds of taken scenarios, or these ideas of child sex trafficking being, out there, know that there's a lot of misinformation happening out there, and you really need to stick with your local community organizations and your local authorities to understand what's real and what's not. So with that, I would like to now introduce our presenters. I'm going to do an abbreviated introduction because their full bios are on the surviveandthriveadvocacy.org website. But I want to start off right away and just give you some background. First of all, Caridad Vaz Bachelor is the task force coordinator for the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force and oversees an over 400-person effort. They are funded by the Office of for Victims of Crime, BJA, Bureau of Justice Assistance, and the Department of Justice. Her work really involves doing exactly what I've already been talking about, collaborating, focusing work throughout the South Florida area. She is an expert in this area. She has done case management. She provides technical assistance. She has supervised caseworkers and provided direct assistance to the survivors of the anti-human trafficking program in Miami, and for a short time in Tallahassee as well. Carrie and I had the opportunity to work together as she supervised our collaborative work in partnership with the International Rescue Committee here in North Florida. So we're grateful to you for that. She has worked with vulnerable populations over the last 6 years, has her master's in criminal justice from FIU and a master's in law from St. Thomas University School of Law. Welcome, Caridad. And Teresa is, I found out today, is originally from New York, from the fine borough of Queens, if I'm remembering right. And you might be able to hear that a little bit when she starts to talk to you. It just warms my heart. I love New York accents. I'm sorry. I'm going a little personal here. But she's worked at DCF now for a while, and she's come back, and she is the human trafficking coordinator for the southeast and southern regions of our state, starting, and she's gotten that job. She got that job in 2018, January. Currently, she provides guidance to the child protective investigators, case management staff, community providers, and all other others in the region regarding the service provision to trafficking victims. She has been a family services counselor with DCF. She works in Broward County primarily. She also has remained with, it says you are with ChildNet for 14 years and a program officer of case management. So that's amazing. You've done so much work, Teresa, as well in this field and with regard to children and protecting children. I want to just also note, too, she's a member of the Arc of Freedom Alliance and Collective Impact Steering Committee. And I love this because also she's able to make sure that the issues of human trafficking are well integrated into all of the other aspects of working with populations that are vulnerable. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our speakers today, and thank you again.
Thank you, Robin. And it's always interesting to start after someone reads your whole bio because you're like, well, that's me. It's nice to meet everyone. I am super honored and appreciative to be invited to speak today, and more so to be able to do it with my good friend Teresa. I just wanted to we're both just going to do our quick hellos before we jump into the formal presentation. It's amazing to see that there's 310 people that are participating, and we hope that we're able to give you all at least one thing you can take away to incorporate in your communities. One thing we wanted to be very clear is that this presentation is not this is what you have to do, but more so this is what we're doing in South Florida. And so we hope that there's information that you can take into your communities. Teresa?
Yeah, I too, thank you so much for inviting us to be here, the opportunity to do anything with Caridad, and excited to see so many folks that I know and new folks that are participating in this event today. And yeah, just again, I would stress this is really for Caridad and I, when we talked about this, we said we really wanted it to be an opportunity for you guys to ask questions and, just let this be an opportunity for us to learn from each other, hear about what's worked for us down in the Southeast and Southern regions, and see if there's anything you'd want to implement in your areas, or just share your questions with us. So hopefully you will leave here today with some new information, or at least some two new contacts in the southern region of Florida, in case you ever have questions after today. We would always be there to entertain those as well.
Yes, and thank you for saying that, Teresa, because we wanted to make sure that this is as much as a presentation, but as well as a conversation. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about, that collaborative approach that we have here in South Florida. That we want to make sure that we highlight, which is that ongoing communication and sharing of best practices and all of that. So we're going to focus on what we consider to be promises and pitfalls. Pitfalls is a strong word. So we don't want it to have that negative connotations, but it's very important for us to acknowledge that there are some challenges that can come with the coordination of partners, coordinating a task force, and doing it in a way that remains victim-centered and trauma-informed as we go through this. As it was mentioned earlier, our task force is quite large, and so how do we keep that consistent through our task force as we function? So here's a slide, really quick overview of the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force and as it is to its current reality. If you see there, the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force was one of the first federally funded task forces back in 2008. So just to give some context for the list, those that are participating in this training today. So as we know, the Trafficking Victim Protection Act passed in 2003. There's been various iterations. And in 2008, they included this language. So originally, it's the first first federal law to define human trafficking, right? It specifically defines sex trafficking and labor trafficking. It breaks down the elements that need to be met for a situation to be considered trafficking. So we have force, fraud, or coercion, which are probably terms, if you're on this, that you may have already just attended so many trainings about. So we don't want to dive too much into the 101, but we want to make sure that we're all on the same playing field when it comes to what we're going to be talking about here in this presentation. When the Trafficking Victim Protection Act was initially passed, it came out with a focus of, with the focus being primarily with foreign nationals, right? Because the idea was that are domestic or US born or those with status can access services already integrated in our community through community agencies like the Department of Children and Family, right, to access SNAP or other community resources. And that foreign nationals, due to lack of status, may not be able to. So this law was kind of focused primarily initially for that. But quickly we learned that the population of victims of human trafficking is so unique, so specialized that the law needed to include every victim of human trafficking. And so initially it was passed, like I said, with that focus, and that there's been so many what they call reauthorizations, so for lack of better words, edits to the law. And that stemmed because we were learning as a community what it really meant, what trafficking looked like realistically in our community, and how we needed to make sure that the law reflected that as we were combating human trafficking in our communities. And so then in 2008, they realized, which is the premise of this presentation, that to combat human trafficking, it needs to be done in a collaborative approach. It needs to be done, not one agency can do it all. And so the reauthorization of 2008 included the final P of partnership. And so when the task force was created originally, that's where it stemmed from, right? How can we bring the South Florida area together and have the community speak one language and understand that establishing the best practices to combating human trafficking in our community. And so, as with everything, and as the law changed, our approach as a task force changed, and we have evolved tremendously over the years. Our task force currently is funded by the Department of Justice, for Office for Victims of Crime and the Bureau of Justice Assistance Program. And that's through what's called an enhanced collaborative partnership with Miami-Dade Police Department and the International Rescue Committee in Miami. But one of the interesting things about our task force is that while we have a primary law enforcement agency and we have a primary victim service provider, we also work very, very closely with the United States Attorney's Office, with our federal partners like Homeland Security, and other local and federal law enforcement agencies and community members. And so why this is so unique, we feel here, is we already have the key players at the table for the initial conversation. We've already made it a priority to have all these people be partners of this movement, of our current funding, so that when we're working on cases or things come up within our community, we're able to have that dialogue and have all the key players there. It's been mentioned that we have over 400 members in our task force. And so people hear that number and they're like, but how? How do you manage this? How is a person identified as a member? And I want to kind of preface back that this is since 2008. So since 2008 to now 2020, that list has grown tremendously. The jurisdiction of the task force has changed over the years. Currently, it covers from Monroe County, so most people would know it as like Key West, all the way to the northern part of Broward County. But there was a time when the task force covered up to West Palm Beach. There was a time where the Victim Service Provider Agency covered all the way to the northwestern part of Florida. And so, as you can imagine, collecting members and getting people to proactively participate in our task force has grown over the years. One of the things for us that we want to make sure that we explain is how this partnership between Miami-Dade Police Department and the International Rescue Committee in Miami works. So as mentioned, Miami-Dade Police Department, primary law enforcement agency. There are local law enforcement partners, and we partner, like I mentioned, with our federal law enforcement agencies as well. And so super excited and proud to announce that the Miami-Dade Human Trafficking Squad just recently got an award for Team of the Year by FDLE and the Missing Children's Advisory Council for the great work that they've been doing within in the anti-trafficking movement, and then specifically during their time when the Super Bowl was in Miami. They had investigated over 280, human trafficking cases. They're the point person or the point agency to make when it comes to Department of Children and Family human trafficking reports. And so they're actively engaged and involved with our community. And, with that said, the International Rescue Committee has been a part of our community here in South Florida, specifically in Miami, since the 1960s. Most people know the International Rescue Committee as a refugee resettlement program, which is the primary work that the IRC does. But in the early 2000s, when the Trafficking Victims Protection Act passed, the IRC was contacted and said, you already have experience working with vulnerable populations. Again, let's keep in mind that the focus was for foreign nationals at the time. And so can you help pilot what this service delivery would look like? And so since 2003, IRC in Miami has been providing direct services, comprehensive services to survivors of human trafficking. And since 2003 has provided direct service to over 560 victims of trafficking. And when we say victims of trafficking, I want it to be very clear that it's of all victims of trafficking. So we're talking minors, adults, males, women, members of the LGBTQIA community. We're talking about foreign nationals and domestic. So that's a broad category um, to cover. And like I said, that jurisdiction that they have for providing the services has changed over the years, but now is in that Tri-County, South Florida area. And so their work has continued to evolve both for the victim service side and law enforcement as we better understand what this looks like in our community. People primarily think of sex trafficking as taking place in South Florida. It is you'll see it in movies and media, you'll see it in the news. It's what catches people's attention primarily when we're talking about human trafficking. But here in South Florida, we see labor trafficking, sex trafficking, we see diverse forms of labor trafficking, domestic servitude. And so when we are thinking of our partnership, which we're going to dive more into, we have to make sure that our partners are as diverse as the type of trafficking that can take place in our community. And so we make that a priority. So we're going to move forward here. This is just to give you guys an idea of what our task force looks like, how it's composed, who was at the table. And so if you look at this, I'm not sure how clear it is for you all, but you have the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force in the middle, and all these dots around it are just all the different various partners and members of our task force that are participating. And you'll see we have law enforcement, of course, we have service providers, we have community members, we have members of the interfaith community, we have community agencies, we have government agencies. It's as diverse as it can be. And then amongst all of that, we have individuals of our community that are interested in either understanding or learning more about human trafficking as it relates to their, communities locally, that also are interested in participating in our task force. So our task force right now is overseen by board members, which our board members are the grant partners that I had previously mentioned. And that's done so to ensure that we are meeting our grant deliverables and doing what we said we would when we receive these funds, and stay, connected to the mission and the focus of the task force. Then you have my role as task force coordinator. This position came into existence in 2018. So as I mentioned, the task force has been around since 2008. So for 10 years, our task force was being maintained and supported by individuals that were doing their full-time jobs. And in this work, it's a huge full-time job. And then also volunteering, for lack of better words, their extra free time to make sure that this task force stayed alive throughout the years. And so when you think about it like that, you realize that the fact that this task force has been able to stay alive and thriving as it has in the community for so long, to me, I would say, is impressive, right? Because that showed the dedication of the South Florida community of making this issue a priority, of trying to make sure that there was a space where individuals can come together and be proactive versus reactive, as we tend to be when we're talking about the anti-trafficking movement in the South Florida community. So the task force coordinator position came along with our recent grant, and it stemmed from the federal government understanding that all these years individuals are volunteering their time, and that it would behoove task forces to have one person that could coordinate, right, all of the moving pieces of a task force, which there are a lot, and we'll talk about that when we talk about some of the promising practices and challenges that we have within the task force. To have one point person to streamline that, to coordinate, to get meetings scheduled, to ensure that the community is being heard, ensure that all sides from law enforcement to community feel like their opinions and thoughts and perspectives are being considered. So all of these things take place, and we want to, and it comes through the support of the task force coordinator role. We have a membership application to ensure that individuals can join our task force, but we do require there be a background check to ensure the safety of our existing members, which oftentimes does include survivors of human trafficking. But we also want to make sure that there's not individuals that are attending our meetings just to gather information about our task force. And so we do have active committees. We'll talk about that in the next slide as part of one of the promising practices that are fully functioning and proactive in our community. And to ensure that there's a space where we can all come together, we meet quarterly. And that's the one space that everyone from all the various sectors can come together and have that conversation about what's going on in our community. We're going to go through these, what we call promising practices and some of the challenges. As I mentioned, task force coordinator, not because I'm the task force coordinator, but for those of you that are part of a task force, having this particular role, if you do have a task force coordinator, I think that there's just so much benefits that come with it to ensuring that the voice and the concern of the community are heard through this individual person. As I mentioned, we have functioning committees. So what does that mean? At the beginning of the year, we sit down, we establish goals. What can the committee do? We have an outreach training and education committee that developed a 3-hour training based specifically on information that we felt we were not hearing in the trainings in our communities. We have the the interfaith committee, which is our way of connecting the faith-based community to the anti-trafficking movement by educating them through training, but also working collaboratively to meet survivors' needs that can't be covered through other funding sources or the case may be, but also bringing them to the table to remind us of all perspectives that are within our community. Then as I mentioned, and I keep highlighting, that collaborative approach that we have is the key to our success. Our committees are composed of members from various organizations, various agencies at different capacity that come to the table, which meets mostly monthly, to ensure that we are tackling whatever is the relevant issue. So for example, our outreach training and education committee, upon COVID happening, we're at a standstill, as it was mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, of like, how do you still connect with your community? How are you still providing training and technical assistance? And so from that, they have established a podcast, which is called Task Force Talks, where that's our space to be able to communicate and connect with our community and share what's going on, and also bring people to the table to just share the resources and things that they have available in the community. And the other piece is that we have community involvement and engagement. And so we take priority in making sure that we go out into our community and let them know what the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force is. But we also take the time to go learn about what it is that they do and contribute, even if it's outside of the human trafficking bubble, right? Because as those of you that may work directly with survivors, their needs go beyond just the trauma that they may have experienced because of the trafficking situation. So we want to make sure that they're connected to our task force with any potential resources or needs that they may have. Some of the challenges that we see in this collaborative approach is always, I think most people will agree, is the funding. While we have funding and it does allow us to do the work that we do, there's just so much more that we could do. If we always say this, right? If we had more funding, we could do so much more. But it is true to ensure that we're reaching a larger group and ensuring that those basic needs are met. And so additional funding is always a support that any task force or agency or community organization that is working with this particular population could benefit from. As I mentioned, running a task force, managing a task force, working collaboratively takes time. It takes time out of those that are volunteering their times to be active members of our committee. It takes time for our board members to work collectively to establish goals and deliverables for what we're doing. And as I mentioned, one of those ongoing things is that visions change. So where the task force was in 2008 to where it is now in 2020, it has evolved, it has grown, and that occurs naturally as we either, one, better learn what trafficking is, we better understand our community, and we continue to expand collaboratively and bring in more people to the table to be able to hear their perspective of what human trafficking means and how it impacts their work. We do have a very diverse membership. And so we would like to continue to diversify our membership, like bringing in the business sector. We want to bring in the perspective of individuals, again, that may not immediately be correlated to the anti-trafficking movement, but could bring great perspective of how human trafficking can impact that. So the business sector, for example, is a huge one. How many times are trafficking situations are occurring in businesses, and how does that impact that? And so if we could have them at the table, it would just also enhance our ability to continue to combat human trafficking throughout South Florida. And so some of our successes with the task force coordinator role, we've been able to expand our existing task force committees, establish goals. We have chairs, we meet consistently. We're working on providing quality to the community and engaging with the community to participate with us to ensure that they're getting as much information as they can about human trafficking or how to work collaboratively with other partners. We've increased our marketing for the task force, like presentations like this, but also through our website, social medias, and attending other community meetings so that they can continue to learn about what the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force is. We have increased our data collection. As all of you know that work within the anti-trafficking movement, data as it relates to human trafficking is most often either not accurate or not reflective of the reality. And so we want to use the task force as a mechanism to be able to start collecting data and providing a real perspective as to what's going on in our community. And so we've done that by establishing an academics committee within the task force that is going to help us make evidence-based decisions to ensure that we're doing things the best way, but also have researchers be able to assist us in collecting data and to really be able to inform our task force and the communities at large of what trafficking looks like in our communities. And then finally, we have institutionalized how the task force functions. We have formalized roles, we have membership, we have policies and procedures. And while those might fall on the wayside for some people, it's important to remember that once we can institutionalize things, then that will allow us to be able to better function. So for example, our services committee, they have developed a service need request form. We were learning over and over again that there were needs that couldn't be met after 5 o'clock, or someone needed a car seat, but how do you specifically find a car seat in the midst of all of the resources that are available? So we created this form that would streamline our task force members being able to specifically request that need that they're not able to find anywhere else. And so that arrives to the task force services committee. We assess it, we connect them, and we then follow up to ensure that referral or resource was actually victim-centered, trauma-informed, that was accountable. It provided the service that it said it was going to do. Because if it's not, then we're no longer going to make that referral to that place. Why? Because we want to make sure that quality is a focus of what we're doing. And we do that all the time. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention here is, and which was segue to Teresa, presentation, is that working collaboratively with other task forces, coalitions, other working community groups, the task force is proactively engaging in those things. And so one of those is the multidisciplinary staffings that take place. The task force has worked with Teresa and her team and the different child protective investigators to be at the table to help assess whether a situation is trafficking or not. And I know Teresa's going to dive more into it, but the fact that when there's a case that comes up, typically it's when we talk about labor trafficking, but a case comes up and Teresa or anyone else knows that, hey, the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force has that expertise that could be brought to the table to support us, that's already a win for us because we're working collaboratively. We're working with a community agency that knows that if a one person doesn't know the answer, we'll find it amongst the 400 members that we have to be able to support. So that was a lot of information about the task force, but we wanted to make sure you got an understanding of how we function and who we are. So as Teresa gets into our conversation of how DCF fits into this bubble and how we work collaboratively, we can further answer your questions. I did see that there was a few questions that came in. I'm gonna read through them and try to address them after Teresa's, or if there's a moment to answer, I will. But we appreciate your engagement, and I will pass it now to Teresa.
Thank you, Caridad. And honestly, a lot, really mostly what I want to be able to share with everybody on the call today. You'll notice I do not have any slides. I decided to just kind of talk with you guys all today and share some of what my experiences have been. I think one of the benefits I have is that I came into this position at a time when our task force in South Florida had already been created. And I can tell you in those 2.5 years, I have seen major changes and advancements take place. And a lot of that has happened based on feedback and input from the individuals within the community. And I say this because sorry about that, I forgot I had a phone in here, is that I want to encourage everybody that's on this training to be a participant, an active participant in your task forces within your communities or coalitions. I can say I have an interesting mix, and I know it did come up in one of the earlier questions in the chat. Were we just focusing on South Florida? Our intention and what we were asked to do today is just to kind of share our experiences, but at the same time, give you all an opportunity to pull from this? What sounds good? What is something that we can consider implementing? But in no way do we think what we're doing in South Florida is a fit for every area in the state of Florida. My position covers from Indian River County through Key West. So clearly those communities differ in many, many ways. They differ in what our populations look like, what the area of lands that each area is responsible for covering, all the way down to the services available. Obviously, services available in Key West do not look the same as the services that are available in Broward County. So we're always having to figure out, how do we as a community come together and figure out how best to serve our survivors of human trafficking. As Caridad mentioned, one of the main roles as the point person for the department is to participate in our multidisciplinary staffings. And in this role, we help to bring together service providers that are actively working with youth and young people, and also bring together the individuals that can help serve them in the future. One of the best things that we do have is that initially, when those calls are brought to the hotline, and it can, as most of you probably already know, it can happen one of two ways. It could come through the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and then those calls would be sent to the local child abuse hotline, or it could go directly to the Florida Abuse Hotline. When those calls are made, the task force members are notified at the same time as I'm notified and other service providers are notified. So there is an opportunity for law enforcement to connect with the child protective investigators from the inception of those investigations, which has a huge impact, not only on our ability to provide timely and appropriate services, but more importantly, the impact on that victim, so that there isn't multiple people day after day going out and trying to have the same conversation. Those conversations are often happening together at the same time. And it's putting them in a position where they feel more at ease and better supported. We all oftentimes also have the ability to have victim advocates with us out on those initial meetings as well, again, to support those individuals who are suspected as victims of human trafficking. The MDT staffings are a time for us to help an investigator determine whether or not this is a verified case of human trafficking. Is there maybe something there, but not enough to verify it? But even more importantly, for us to come up with a service plan for that young person. As Caridad expressed, oftentimes we have cases of labor trafficking come up, and I always remind people, we are not the experts. Those cases don't come up as often as they probably should be, because it is an area that I think still continues to go underreported in the state of Florida. And all of us within our networks are making efforts to do additional presentations to help people identify what are those signs and indicators of labor trafficking, so those reports can be made. But most importantly, when that report does come in, I will be the first one to pick up the phone, reach out to Caridad, reach out to our contacts at IRC, even contacts of the department with the Office of Refugee Services. Because the reality is there are services and benefits that these individuals may be eligible to receive that the average child protective investigator is not going to be aware of. So again, it shows that with that collaboration, we're able to better support our survivors of human trafficking, and that no one within this network should feel that it is their sole responsibility to have all the answers and to know how to do this on their own. Because without each other, we're not going to be able to support the survivors as we need, because nobody's an expert in everything. And you shouldn't think that you need to be able to serve individuals within this community. We all need to recognize what is it that we're best at. And if you're not best in one piece of it, well, find the person in your community that is and bring them in and bring them to the table. Because without that, we're not really going to be able to help each other. I know that there's, Caridad mentioned data. I always like to bring that up when I have an opportunity, because I'm a big stickler. It's really important when people are sharing information, and this goes a little bit also to what Robin shared in the beginning, when there's things put out in the media or numbers and data shared about what the number of human trafficking victims look like in Florida or statewide or nationally. It's important to really pay attention to where that information is coming from and how is that information being captured. Because a lot of times, and it's crazy and unfortunate, but there is a level of sensationalism that is placed when it comes to talking about human trafficking. It's eye-catching. The media loves to talk about it, and at the end of the day, there aren't always true facts to support the information being shared. I appreciated that Robin said, go back and talk to the people within your community. Reach out to your DCF contact or your task force contact to say, hey, this has been going on. I saw this on Facebook. Is there any truth to it? I know that I recently had people do that to me. And then we were able to get some information that was sent out through Polaris, which is the agency that is responsible for manning the National Human Trafficking Hotline, that specifically spoke to some of the things that have been put out in the media recently, and explaining how there really are not facts and there aren't things to back up what some of those extra wild, I should say, accusations are that have been out there lately. So really, I guess my greatest thing is just think about how you can tackle this together. When you run across people who don't think this is an issue, I will give you some numbers. 2019, the state of Florida had 1,960 abuse reports called in, and these are as to minors only. Any number I will give you is always coming from the statewide database that tracks the reports that come into the hotline, the Florida Abuse Hotline. Out of those reports, we had 1,807 for sex trafficking and 153 for labor trafficking. Again, huge disparity, and realistically, we all know there's more labor trafficking cases out there. We all just have to do a better job of identifying those individuals who are involved in labor trafficking. We had 442 of those cases were verified and 496 that were closed not substantiated. And for those who may not know what that means, it means there was something there, but not enough for a child protective investigator to verify it. And throughout the process of staffing these cases, that's where our law enforcement partners come in, and they're able to look into those cases, whether they're verified or not substantiated. If we have information that, any sort of lead that law enforcement can look into, that information is shared with them so that we can see whether or not we can identify if there is a third-party trafficker involved. And I think one of the last things I want to touch on in closing my piece is just really the talk about social media and young people who are, so many of them, if not almost all of them, doing school virtually right now. I have 2 teenagers myself who are doing school virtually, and they are clearly online even more than they were before. And I think the most important thing for all of us to remember is that thinking that you can keep your child off the internet is not realistic. So what's most important is the same way you're taking the time to educate yourself right now, we need to educate our young people. And that's how we're going to keep them safe. Because even if you say you can't be on Instagram, you can't be on Snapchat, they're going to go grab their friend's phone and be on the account that they've already created that you don't know about, and they're going to do it. So it's really more important for us to help them to understand, what are those risks? What are the things that, they need to look for to keep themselves safe and to keep their friends safe. That's an honest conversation I have with my kids all the time about how, it's our responsibility to be there and support and take care of each other, and that, they should be doing that for their friends too. And the more comfortable they are in having these kind of conversations and understanding what the realities are, the quicker they are going to be to talk to somebody if there is something, some creepy critter that shows up on their, on Discord or something like that, one of their gaming sites, and tries to approach them offline. So they're going to be more likely to then come forward and share that information with an adult that they trust. I could talk about a million other things, but I know I want to leave some time for some questions, because there were some great questions and things that were already brought up. So I will end for that part right now.
Teresa, there was a good question that came up. I think that you would be the best to answer. The question was, if there's a child that is living, I think it's the question I'm looking for it now, is living with a trafficker, who all is involved in removing that child from the trafficking situation, and how would that take place?
Sure. So I can give the general answer, because obviously every situation is going to be specific and individual. But the way we would become made aware of the situation is that call coming through either the national hotline or the Florida abuse hotline. A child protective investigator would be assigned. And in that narrative, it would give them some information about what is the situation, what is the cause for concern. So within that narrative, it's telling you that the caretaker of that child or someone else living within that home is the suspected perpetrator of human trafficking. Then probably 9 times out of 10 that's going to be a removal situation, and or if there's a cause for law enforcement to make an arrest of that individual, so the alleged perpetrator is taken out of the home and the child's able to remain in the home safely, it could happen one or two ways. And I can say I've seen it happen both ways. It really just depends on, who the other people are in that child's life. Did the other people in the home, were they aware of the situation and knew that this child was at risk? Or was it a situation where they had no idea and they are committed to keeping that child safe? I can also say that I'm probably 99% sure it will be a court case and an open dependency case either way, so that there is some ongoing oversight in those situations. Did I get all the parts of that question?
I was going back to check, but I think so.
Yes, I think you did. I think you did. And I think, Carrie, you were going to do the other one on the labor trafficking question about labor trafficking during disasters. What happens? How does that coordination take place? Is there anything else you want to talk about on that?
Sure. So I think, again, when we talk about that collaborative approach that we have within this task force, one agency or one group can't do it. So what this does, and we do know that there's a disaster, a hurricane, anything coming into our community, the best thing that we can do is to make sure that the agencies or partners within the task force that are providing direct services are being proactive and communicating with those, maybe the victims or survivors that they're already working with, but also within their community. So there's a ton of outreach that not currently due to COVID-19 that was taking place before. So primarily, we see a lot of labor trafficking in the Homestead, more southern parts of Miami. And I know, for example, the International Rescue Committee in Miami were doing proactive outreach events, right? Going out into those areas, and the outreach material that was being provided was not flyers, it wasn't paper, it was actually like tote bags and visors, things that they could actually use while they were still out doing the work if that's what they had to do. But all of it had the National Human Trafficking Hotline number on it, right? So what this allowed us to do was to do the outreach, communicate with the people that are in that community that may be at risk of being trafficked or are being trafficked, and say, hey, if you need assistance, here's the National Human Trafficking Hotline, but doing it in a way that we weren't putting that person or people in danger because they're holding a flyer that says human trafficking on it, right? It was a tote that they could take around to do their job. It was a visor because it's sunny in South Florida and you need to make sure you're wearing a visor that may have a logo or something, but there's no connotation or connection to the word human trafficking. So one of the things that like I said, the IRC here in Miami and other organizations that are part of the task force is that proactive approach, not reactive. And that's not always easy because you don't know when a disaster is coming. You don't know kind of that, you have a shorter time frame to really be proactive. But if you are doing it ahead of those moments, right? If you're engaging with your community, when we cover the West Palm Beach area, right, there were a specific, and even here within Miami-Dade and Broward, there are specific organizations that are embedded in the community, right? Like that they know who to call when a mass message needs to be sent, right? If you don't know that before the disaster, you're already behind the 8 ball, right? That's why it's so important, and I was prefacing that with my presentation, get involved with your community, get involved, get engaged, participate so that you have the space to go into those communities. It could be a community event, it could be, a gathering of local people, but because they recognize your face, because they recognize who you are going to be more receptive to your message versus it seeming like an outsider coming in, telling them what to do and how to do it, right? And so that does take a little bit more work, right? But it allows us, again, to be proactive, not reactive. And we have found that to be successful. Labor trafficking, in general, right? Most individuals are migrant workers. They travel with the work. And so while they may be in South Florida right now, they may end up in North Florida.
Mhm.
Florida has a lot of agricultural work throughout the state of Florida, different agriculture that takes place in different seasons. So while they may be right now in South Florida, they may very much end up in North Florida, right? To do work. And so if they got that National Human Trafficking Hotline when they were here locally, and now they're in North Florida and they say, hey, call the hotline, I'm in trouble, or I need help, if that's the route they take, they'll be able to call the STAC, the IRC, and be able to be connected. And so that's where this goes beyond the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force, right? I know that there was a few questions like, is this just about the task force? I think it's important to look beyond it versus just what we're doing here locally. But these are, again, hopefully approaches that we hope you can either find that could work with your community or you can start to implement within your community, so that that as we work to abolish human trafficking in our communities, we're doing it in a collaborative with a collaborative approach and as a forefront of our mindset of doing it.
I wanted to kind of jump in on a case example here that actually happened to us after Hurricane Michael with regard to labor trafficking, which we did we supported a man who was labor trafficked here to work on construction after the hurricane. So that's, I think, what a lot of people think about. They think about the destruction, they think about workers coming in after something like that. And the thing about this individual that was so compelling for us and for me personally, I remember, is that we had done the work to talk to a local healthcare provider who, has a very, very big practice here in our area, Tallahassee Primary Care Associates, who said, we believe in your issue. We believe in this issue. We want to help. So if you ever have anyone who needs assistance, we will provide that assistance for free. And when you're doing this kind of work, and it's often like somebody needs it right now, you don't have time to make sure they're on, they have various insurance or Medicaid or anything. It's like they need help now. And I was so grateful. And that came through the Rotary Club. Okay. So when you think about the work you do, there's all of these kind of things. The other part about disasters too, mentioning labor trafficking and provision of labor, we had a situation where someone showed up at the local homeless shelter. She had been preyed on by a man who was, instead of saying, you're beautiful, I'll be your boyfriend, or I'll make you a model, or whatever it is, that kind of process of grooming and seduction that sex traffickers do, this guy promised to help her apply for FEMA benefits. And so then he was insinuating himself, of course, into when that check came in, guess who would get the money, et cetera. So I want people to kind of have an idea that don't limit your imagination to how despicable and how this can happen after disasters. There were a couple of questions. I want to highlight some things I put in the chat for you all. Someone asked about missing kids in schools. I posted information about the Department of Education in Florida's website, their human trafficking website, and the name of Valerie Ellery, who is their coordinator. So you asked about, missing kids from schools. Valerie would be your contact point. You could find out all that information in there. I also put the Attorney General's website on there. Some of you were saying, how can I sign up? That lists all of the task forces around the state of Florida. And for those of you who are out, watching us outside the state of Florida, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is your resource to try to find out who in your area is doing some of this work. Like, I know IRC and you all are probably listed on the National HT Hotline's referral source. So is STAC, so are many organizations. So you'll find out if you want information that is there. We also put up information too. Someone asked, by the way, let me go back on this. I put up information about prior Third Friday trainings that have been done. So we did have Valerie Ellery present on the schools here. And after this is over, within about a week, we will post the video of this presentation. So you'll be able to see this if you want to, kind of go back and look or share it with any of your colleagues or your own task force. This would be a great thing to show during a task force meeting, I think, just to kind of expose or share with your own local task forces so they can have some information about what's happening. Um, Somebody just asked, as a mental health provider, are there any HT assessments you can use? And do you all want to take that, or I can put a couple up here?
I think the assessments that we use is really specific to the statewide human trafficking screening tool, which I will put out there is absolutely still being reviewed and determined whether or not it is a tool that can be validated. If any resources that Robin may have, definitely I think would be great for people to look at and consider. And you can always actually reach out to places like the National Human Trafficking Hotline and the Polaris website to see what kind of information and resources they have there as well. Because there isn't, as long as this has been going on, we haven't gotten to a point yet where we have this pool of validated tools and evidence-based services, because all these things take time. And in some cases, especially when you're talking about evidence-based services, there's a financial cost to a service provider for that. I am excited to say that there are many places throughout the state of Florida and many service providers that are doing the work to get there. In many ways, Florida is actually more progressive than other states, at least when it comes specific to the work that we're doing in human trafficking. But we still have a way to go. If you don't mind, Robin, there was a question that kind of talked again about a service provider question, if I could read it and answer that as well. So we had a question from Rebecca that as a service provider who's worked with young youth being trafficked, I've had a few cases where the youth is not willing or able to turn in their trafficker and they remain in their unsafe situation. How can we support these youth towards safety when they're not willing to provide evidence to police and or DCF? So you're kind in saying sometimes. I think that often, unfortunately, especially upon initial investigation, is the situation that we're in. And what I would ask of you as a service provider is to be patient. Stay close to them, be supportive. There will come a time that they are likely to share some information with you. It's just not going to be on the time schedule that we likely want. And it's scary. And, there were times when I was working with youth and case management and they would go on elopement and I would tell them how scared I was during that time because I wanted to know they were safe and I wanted to know that they were going to be okay. And I think the more that you're able to engage with a young person in an exploitive situation and have them know that you're going to be there, whether they talk now or they talk later, it doesn't matter, you're there. There will come a time where they're ready to share information. And, my experience is working with law enforcement in my range of areas, which I'm sure most of you will be able to say the same, is when that information comes forward, they are more than happy and willing to jump on it. So we engage our task force as early on as possible. They make their efforts to talk to those young people, but we always know that we can come back a month, 6 months later and say, hey, remember this youth we talked to you about? Well, now they're ready and they'll go out and they will connect with that young person. And I really think that that's really the only trick is patience and really working on your engagement with that young person. Carrie, I don't know if you have anything else you'd want to share.
No, I think you answered it spot on, right? I think when you're working with this particular population, as both you and I have, especially within this particular community, it's consistency. They need to know that you'll be there, even if they do, if you're not able to contact them for a while, like when they're ready, you're there. And sometimes that is the hardest part of doing this work, especially when most of us come from a space of, concern and wanting to help. But when we're victim centered and we're trauma informed, sometimes it does require us to respect the decisions that individuals are making. And when we're talking about children, I think oftentimes is people put it in their mindset where they're children, we're adults, we're telling them what to do. But if you're truly going to be victim centered, you always want to make sure that the victim, even if a minor, feels like they're being heard and that their perspectives are being understood. And while indefinitely some decisions may be made on their best interest, you're able to build way more rapport, which will then lead to the next piece of getting that additional information that you need by being consistent and being a support and being victim centered. to that point, I see a question here that came up about the hotline and like, should they also call law enforcement after calling the hotline? And so I wanted to explain a little bit how the hotline works. I actually had the great pleasure of going and meeting with the hotline, and it was interesting. But the reason why we always promote the National Human Trafficking Hotline is for this reason. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is a convener of information and is able to make immediate contacts when necessary, right? So as Teresa mentioned, if someone calls the National Human Trafficking Hotline and makes a report for trafficking, the hotline has already done their due diligence to have the primary contacts of the area that they're in. So in South Florida, they know to send it to the select people who would be able to proactively work on those cases, one of them being the task force, Department of Children and Family. And so that is immediately shared with everyone at the same time. And then there's systems in place already to be able to know what to do next. So when that information or that tip comes in from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, DCF sees it and the law enforcement partners see it, right? DCF knows that law enforcement is going to go out. They have to go check out and see what's going on. They also know that DCF will be going out to have to do a wellness check and do their part of it, right? So part of the success I think that we've seen, and of course with trial and error, and there's been evolutions and growth in it, is that everyone knows their lane, knows what they're going to be contributing to the efforts to ensure that the best interest of the child or the person that, adult, if it's a case relating to an adult, is being taken care of, right? So in that, to give a more clear example, someone calls from Miami and is able to report that they are a victim of human trafficking, they need services, or they're needing to be removed from a trafficking situation. The hotline captures that information. The hotline will then call, if it's an adult, in this case, right, call the law enforcement agency directly, but will also call any of the victim service providers that are vetted through their system as true human trafficking victim service providers. And in this, in Miami, they'll call the IRC in Miami and say, hey, here's the relevant information that you need to know regarding this case. So they need direct service. Law enforcement, if law enforcement has been contacted or not, law enforcement has been contacted, or this is what's going on. And then everyone knows their place. And because we are already working collaboratively as a task force, we can call our law enforcement partners and say, hey, this case has come in. What are you guys doing proactively? Do you need our support? What do they need? Emergency needs? Do they need clothing? Do they need food? Do we need to get a hotel or a place for them to stay? Like, all of those things are done, but it's almost done simultaneously. So there's no need for them to call the hotline and then call law enforcement, like local law enforcement as well. If you feel like it's an urgent matter and you need, help, call 911, of course, an emergency, and get that support. But if it's someone that is just seeking support or wanting to report the trafficking situation, it will all go through its process through the National Human Trafficking Hotline.
Great. I think there was a question early on in the presentation about someone looking kind of, I would say, taking a wider lens and looking at sort of the hypersexualization of children on some new TV shows. And I just wanted to respond and say thank you for recognizing that this issue takes place in a wider context of our culture. I remember a while back, I got a magazine from AAA, and it had a picture of a young woman. Sorry, there I did it. A child who was made up from, and she looked like she might have been from Southeast Asia, maybe, but totally made up in sort of an ethnic costume. But she was clearly, presented as a young adult. And I felt very strongly that they were hypersexualizing this child and almost advertising this child to come and see her when you go and visit Thailand or wherever it was. So I think that it's important that people recognize that the hypersexualization of culture does definitely have an impact on how sex traffickers often target, solicit, and groom victims in terms of them, making sure that they, might get a new outfit or, doing things that make sexualize that child more than that child would normally do. But then the child looks around and says, this is what everybody else is doing, so why don't I, proceed, right? And why don't I take advantage of? So I think that this is a really important question, and it might be your local task force would want to look at that. Like, what's going on in your community? Do you want to write a letter to the editor? Do you want to do something with perhaps writing something to Netflix or HBO or whoever is doing these shows. So so I think that that's out there. Is there anything else y'all would like to add? Does your task force ever kind of take that wider lens and look at culture and some of the kind of breeding grounds, it feels like?
Oh, I'm already I was like, let me unmute. Yeah, so South Florida is a melting pot of all sorts of cultures, right? And it's always interesting that balance between respecting a culture and respecting kind of their cultural norms, and then how that impacts the further exploitation of an individual, right? And so we definitely have seen culture definitely being a tool, for lack of better words, as part of the exploitation. And we see that, like, for example, in our labor trafficking cases, we've seen examples where someone from within the same community that may have been in an exploited situation, but will bring another person in. So, for example, we have a foreign national who comes to the United States, wants to work. Okay, that's their goal. They came here, they want to work, they want to provide for their families back home. They meet someone here that is from the same cultural background. They trust that person because, hey, I've been through this. I don't have papers either. I provide back home. So what connects them outside of anything else is that culture, right? But sometimes our cultural norms, depending on where we're from, don't quite align with what are here locally, here in the United States, here in South Florida, we find to be appropriate, right? And so we oftentimes will come into contact with survivors and they're like, but that's normal in my country. I've been working since I was 8. Like, that's not a problem, right? And so respecting cultures, but trying to educate that, okay, while that may be normal in your home country, here in the United States, we have labor laws. We have these types of laws to protect you from being further exploited and further victimized. And then when we talk about the sexual exploitation and things like that, it's like you said, Robin, right? Someone may unfortunately fall into being groomed because they're participating in what is being the culture of, like, the young people to be, what is this, on TikTok and all these social media platforms. And that's our cultural norm. Everybody wants to be on there. And as Teresa said, as much as you may want to prevent your children from getting on there, they're most likely already on there. And so let's open up that dialogue. But that's the culture. They want to be cool. They want to be a part of it. And so that opens the door for people and traffickers to come in and try to further exploit. So I think the culture piece, I think Vic made a comment about it. Like, that's a huge part of this. And we need to make sure that we keep it as part of the conversation of when we're talking about human trafficking, because that impacts a lot of perspectives of how to continue to combat it.
Just wanted to add a little bit more. So I did a little research because I had a couple of people ask me about this movie and the intent of that movie and what the director's intent was completely opposite of being exploitive. It was trying to really show what some of the challenges are of young people from her home country. How it was portrayed and what some of what you see throughout the movie is challenging, and I do understand that. But I always encourage people, before you go on a campaign, to not, to boycott something, get the backstory and try to figure out what part of it is it that we're challenged with. If the intent was good, okay, let's recognize that, but maybe it could have been done in a different way. And just like Caridad brought up about Instagram, so I'm only on Instagram because my children are on Instagram. I've never been on Facebook, so I am like the most non-social media person out there, I think. But the reality is I sit there and I look and I see people posting pictures of their 5 and 6-year-olds, too done up, in my opinion. So although it's important for us to pay attention to things that end up in mass media, like movies, like Cuties, we need to pay attention to what our friends, family members, or ourselves are posting on social media of our children or the young people in our lives. If you have never heard about an agency called Child Rescue Coalition, I encourage you to go to their website. There's lots of great information about the work that they do, but they also talk a lot about what that social media footprint looks for a young child in society today. And the reality is, we as parents and caretakers start that. So it's really important for us to, yes, pay attention to the things that are out in mass media, but when we can have influence on, as trainers, as presenters, as I like to say, citizens of the world, give that feedback to people about, really being mindful about how much you're posting and what you're posting and how, what are the pictures you're posting of your children on social media. I can assure you there will never be a photo of my children in bathing suits on social media. Like, not going to happen, because there are people on social media for the wrong reasons.
That definitely. And there's so many aspects to this. I just put up a link to Sail of Freedom. We have co-presented with Sail of Freedom, and they had a contract. They might still with the Florida Department of Education to do training in schools. What I really liked about their presentations was that they did a whole piece on how advertisers show a sweater that's being meant to be sold to a male versus one to a female. And they have the woman, then I did it again. They have the child posing like a woman in a bed, and they have the guy standing there with just a sweater on. And they're saying, what's different about how this ad company is portraying youth in our culture? And they go through pretty, compelling training. And I will tell you, they did it to all the high schools. We had all the high schools do something in Jackson County here. All of these seniors and juniors, their jaws were dropping. And when they really connected the dots between this kind of cultural phenomenon, and also the fact that a lot of, I think, youth are very naive about social media, how they can be preyed on and all those kind of things. So take a look, everybody, at Sail of Freedom's website. I have found them to be quite good on this issue. Any other questions that have come in? People have noted that we need to change the culture on how boys are raised to respect women, and women to respect, I would say women and men, boys and girls. We've seen also, and you might have seen as well, that the targeting and the vulnerability of people in the trans community is so high. Mm-hmm. And what are we doing with regard to transphobia, homophobia, how people are increasingly made more vulnerable by the messaging in our society that's really so hateful to certain groups. So I would add that. Anything else y'all want to add on any of these topics?
I think I saw one other question where someone was asking about doing training for youth in schools. And what I would say is for you to reach out to your local school board, because each area is doing it a little different. In most cases, you have to go through some sort of vetting process. Sometimes it may be submitting your materials to the school to be approved as a trainer. But if it is a skill that you have, and you're interested, and I would ask, and if you feel really super comfortable in training youth, because even if you're a trainer, it doesn't always mean that you're the best trainer to train a bunch of teenagers or middle schoolers or whatever it may be. I would definitely encourage you to reach out to your local school board to see how it is that you can support and help any of the advancements that they're trying to do in this area as well.
And that certification, someone's asking about a certification for people who work in the field. You mentioned, I think DOE is putting together that kind of certification to do the training in the schools. But as far as I know, I don't know of any certification in general to be a human trafficking trainer or educator. Do you all know of anything?
To be a training or educator, there is not one right now. There is a human trafficking certification that is offered by whoever your Department of Children and Family representatives are in your area, as it relates to case managers and child protective investigators. I can say in my regions, I have had several service providers actually go through the training. Some of our service providers that specifically serve survivors of human trafficking have gone through the training so that they are then able to administer the human trafficking screening tool. So it would be reaching out to your local contacts. And if you were on the Department of Children and Families website, you would be able to look under human trafficking and figure out who your people are within your areas that would be able to do that training. And the training it's the human trafficking certification training, and it's a 6-hour certification. And again, you have my contact information right here. If anybody has some specifics or wants to know who exactly to contact in their area to find out more about it, you can always feel free to call me, text me, email me, and I can make sure I can link with you with those individuals.
That's great. Somebody's asking about an ICAC, CXC. I guess that's International Child Advocacy Center training. Do you know about that? Anybody know about that?
I
Jim
don't.
Jolly, I know you're on and you're with the Florida group. Internet. Oh, sorry, I got that totally wrong. Internet. It's called the Internet Crimes Against Children training. So no, I don't know anything about that. Do you all?
I'm not aware of any specific certification training. I know oftentimes that there are trainings that are offered in this area. And I could look to see, if I have anything that's coming up, and I can share it with Robin, and I'm sure she would post that on her website. Especially right now, there's lots of trainings that people are doing related to internet crime and internet safety as well.
Right. And what is it? The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is another group. And I'll say that again. It's the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC. They have done this work for a while. And much of it does involve trafficking of children, as well as other missing children issues, of course. Y'all, did I miss any other questions? I have another post here. Jim, you're helping us a lot here. There's a media tool for reporting on rape and sexual violence to share with media contacts. I'm just going to put that up so you all can have that information. Anything else here that we missed? I think we got all the questions.
I think we did.
Absolutely wonderful. Just terrific. So thank you both so much. This worked out great. I think you've got me kind of hooked on having six slides in a PowerPoint to do one of these 90-minute training. Awesome. So there is something to be said for brevity. All right. At least in words, and that's good for a lawyer like me to hear. So here's my contact information, everybody. I encourage you to go on STAC's website, surviveandthriveadvocacy.org. You can stay posted on things that are coming up. Note that the next month's training is going to be on social justice issues and human trafficking, October 16th. After that, in November 20th, we're going to have a presentation from the Department of Juvenile Justice on DJJ issues, and really look forward to you doing that.